These days, there are people talking again about things like war readiness or military capability. I think Helmut Schmidt would have slapped them in the face for that. He would have said, "Have they all gone crazy? Do they even know what they're talking about?" Our lives will end up being destroyed by this kind of thinking. Germany has become quite a provincial country. And when Mr. Merz says that Russia is also a barbaric country, what gives him the right to say that? He doesn't actually know, but one thing it is.
It's racism.
Music is never a weapon. Music is always a bridge. And when we make music, we do it out of love for people. That's a great source of inspiration and something truly wonderful. Music.
Against the current, about the person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wir zeigen Ihnen Positionen.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. We bring you viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to keep quiet about. His work is familiar to many of us from childhood. He's inspired millions of people to love classical music. As a conductor, he's truly world-class. He founded the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival and made television history with shows like Attention, Classical Music. He's an 82-year-old teenager, always up for a bit of fun. For example, last year in Moscow, we climbed up the fire escape to the roof of our hotel. Welcome, Justus Frantz. I'm happy to see you, dear Patrick. Justus, you've just become a professor at the conservatory. How's the work going?
Professor am Konservatorium. Wie läuft die Arbeit an?
Well, I felt really comfortable. First, the orchestra is excellent. Second, the university director, or president, is a particularly kind man, Mr. Sokolov, who also shows respect for achievement and for other opinions, and I like that very, very much. And yesterday, I gave my first master class for conductors and pianists. It was about a piano concerto, the fourth piano concerto by Beethoven. And of course that means you're very focused on the piano. It gave me tremendous joy. I walked into this lecture hall that was completely full. I honestly hadn't expected that. And everyone stood up when I came in. A sign of respect. Yes, a sign of respect. That's right. And that's how it used to be back in our schools too.
Und früher war das bei uns in der Schule auch so. Heute höre ich ja manchmal, dass Lehrer angegriffen werden.
These days, I sometimes hear that teachers are being attacked. Thankfully, that's never happened to me. But in any case, it gave me tremendous joy to work with these wonderfully talented young people and to show them a little of how we might interpret things differently in Germany. Over the years, I've performed many concerts with Herbert von Karajan, with Leonard Bernstein, with Schulte, and with others. And through that, I really absorbed, well, not as a teenager exactly, but as a young man, the great traditions, the great history of interpretation. Because Karajan, of course, had fantastic teachers and knew some truly remarkable conductors. And I don't just mean Furtwängler, but many others as well. And the same goes for Leonard Bernstein.
Von vielen anderen auch und Leonard Bernstein ganz genauso. Und dadurch bin ich auch hineingewachsen.
And that's how I grew into a musical tradition that very few people know today. And that's why I really enjoy passing it on. Because when I was a young man, I was supported by the people I just mentioned, and by many others as well. By Karajan, by Bernstein, by Celibidache, and I don't even know who else. I grew up with that tradition. I grew up with that knowledge. And since they supported me back then, I see it as my responsibility now to pass it on to young people.
And there are some characteristic differences in how the pieces of music are interpreted. That was something I found interesting during our preliminary talk.
Yes, a foreigner who thinks that much about German music, or rather, about Germans themselves, might think we're not that free. But actually, we're often freer in how we interpret things than others are. For example, I'm thinking of a famous recording of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto with Furtwängler. That was made at a time when there were bombing raids, when Berlin was really, well, it was pure luck if you could even go to a concert.
Berlin wirklich eigentlich, das war immer ein Glück, wenn man ein Konzert besuchen konnte. Und wie dramatisch Furtwängler und mit
And the way Furtwängler conducts that Brahms, so dramatic, with all those rubatos, those delays and accelerandos, those shifts in tempo, it's just unique. Anyone who knows that recording knows it's full of technical issues, of course, given the time it was made. And Edwin Fischer, well, let's be honest, he wasn't exactly the most technical pianist, but he was without a doubt one of the greatest dramatists. That's why it's such a fantastic recording. And anyone who's listened to it knows that Germans handle their sense of tempo more freely than some people who talk a lot about Germany but don't really know this music.
Nicht so sehr das kennt, aber mehr über Deutschland spricht.
How do you still manage to come together here at the conservatory in Moscow? How do you find a shared path, a common interpretation?
Ich glaube, naja, also ein Dirigent kann sich
Well,
nicht in einem Orchester.
I think, a conductor can't just go along with everyone in the orchestra. He has to set the direction, make clear what he wants. And they need to really experience what I'm doing, so that even if I do something completely unexpected, they stay with me. And now I have to knock on every table, knock on wood, because tomorrow evening is that big concert at the conservatory. I just hope that the freedom they give me, because they choose to follow me, and it could easily be different, that I can really live out that freedom tomorrow, and in doing so, bring a truly vibrant interpretation of Brahms's First Symphony to life.
Erste Symphonie hier zustande bringe.
The role of professor is familiar to you. You've already been a university lecturer at the Music Academy once before.
Ja, ich war schon öfter. Ich war sogar auch schon in China Professor.
I've done that quite a few times. I was even a professor in China, and I still am, actually. But in Germany, you usually retire at 65, or in my case, I stopped a bit earlier. That was mainly because of the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. And then there were other festivals, too. I founded the Mecklenburg Festival, for example. I was also a patron of the MDR Music Summer and involved in many other projects. I really enjoyed all of that. But at the time, I felt that the regular work with young people was starting to fall short. That's why I decided to stop a bit earlier.
Dass die zu kurz kommt. Deswegen habe ich auch früher aufgehört.
We never talked about that. Your life has also been shaped by the experience of flight and displacement. What does it feel like for you to be here today, playing and teaching in Moscow?
Naja, also erstmal muss ich dir sagen, dass ich
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that I think I was already on the run several times before I was even born, because my mother was simply afraid. So we went all the way to the east. But that didn't work out either, because suddenly we had to go back west to my grandparents. And then, during the low-flying air raids, when we were trekking along with probably thousands or even millions of others, that's what people called it back then, we were out looking for food. My mother, my grandparents, and whoever else in the family was an adult, they were on the move. The children stayed on the wagon. But of course, when those planes came in low, everyone jumped off in fear for their lives. Only I stayed there, because I was in a stroller and couldn't walk yet. And then a grenade exploded not far from me. I have no idea what that did to me. But someone in my family told me recently that they once tried to tickle me or somehow get a reaction out of me. But apparently, I just pulled up my shoulders like I was all tense, and I must have been in terrible shock. I couldn't get over it at first, but of course, I couldn't express myself either. Nobody knew what was going on because I was simply quiet.
Aber ich konnte mich auch gar nicht ausdrücken. Das wusste ja keiner, aber ich war eben einfach still und war unbeweglich.
And I was completely stuck. But then all of a sudden things started moving again. I don't remember any trauma from that time, and I never really experienced it that way myself. What I did have was a very good, though fatherless youth in Schleswig-Holstein, where relatives took us in with incredible generosity. I know that some refugees back then weren't always welcomed, but I was always made to feel like you're one of us. You're, so to speak, one of the owners of this beautiful, wonderful estate, Tesdorf, in Schleswig-Holstein.
And you're someone who can express yourself today. We've once again entered a time of war. Does music give you a sense of security, a kind of inner peace?
Eine innere Ruhe.
Da muss ich darüber nachdenken. Das ist sehr unterschiedlich.
I'd have to think about that. It's very different. When I listen to Brahms, there's hardly any music more sorrowful. Right from the beginning, it feels like an accusation against the world. Brahms understands the struggles of our lives, our loneliness, our closeness to death, all of it. And he finds a way to stay with us through our fears, through our deepest anxieties. But he stays by our side. Beethoven, on the other hand, gives us hope. When we feel like we've reached the end, some people turn to antidepressants. I always say, no, listen to Beethoven or play Beethoven, then you won't need any of that. Because Beethoven takes us by the hand and shows us the world can be overcome, and it can be overcome through our will and our creativity. And Mozart, well, that's something completely different again. And I won't even start talking about Bach's faith, his strength, and his genius. But Brahms is a composer who accompanies us in an incredible way, through grief, through despair. And then suddenly, because we're able to let all that out, we somehow feel more secure. It's as if we've said everything that needed to be said. Like when you talk to a good friend, tell them your worries and fears, and suddenly they're gone. That's kind of how it feels to me.
Is Brahms the truly kindred composer of our time?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, composers who are a bit younger and who are also important. But for me, Brahms is one of the truly great ones. Maybe that's also because I remember after the war, we were living in this beautiful castle, and somehow through music everyone came together. And strangely enough, it was always Brahms who played a big role in bringing people together. Back then, around 1946 or so, there were people who might have been Nazis. And then there was my family, who had mostly been part of the resistance, and many others. But through the music, they found each other, and through the shared grief over a destroyed life and a destroyed country.
Does it also play a role when you're designing a new music festival on Gran Canaria?
Gran Canaria is so weit weg.
Gran Canaria feels so far away, almost like a final place of escape that hasn't been touched by the confusion of a misguided society. It's a place where you can still just watch the sun rise and set, and the amazing plant life there, so green, especially compared to the desert, takes on a completely different meaning. I'd say Gran Canaria is, in a way, an escape into a dream, but one that's alive.
Is this kind of escape into a dream that's still alive also what the new Spanish government represents, which has just...
Well, I'm really only in a position to comment on the German government. We'll get to that.
But I won't say anything about the Spanish one. You're the founder of the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. So when you look back today at that festival and at the state where you lived, could you say, borrowing from Heinrich Heine, when I think of Schleswig-Holstein at night, I lose my sleep?
No. I don't think I want to judge the governments in Kiel, and honestly, I couldn't even if I wanted to. I've been away from Schleswig-Holstein far too long. If there's anything I can really talk about, it's the forests, the beech forests that stretch all the way to the Baltic Sea and down to the beaches. But of course, Schleswig-Holstein, and Brahms was in a way half from there since both his parents came from Dithmarschen, He grew up with the songs of Germany, or rather, of the North, and those songs aren't always very cheerful. A biographer once said about Brahms, when Brahms is in a happy mood, he sings that the grave is his joy.
People first got to know you through the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival, which you founded, though lately you haven't been quite as welcome there.
What's the current situation? Well, that's true, but it really has nothing to do with the music. From the very beginning, I was always in favor of building bridges. And I'd say I'm a pretty good student of Helmut Schmidt, who played a major role in my life. Our friendship actually started when I was about 17 or 18. I think Schmidt had a son who passed away, and maybe they sometimes thought he could be like our son at that age. That might have made our relationship even stronger. Helmut Schmidt was, of course, an incredible advocate for peace. He used to say, "There's nothing worse than war." And in the end, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the turmoil and the aftermath of the war, at least in my memories, but I didn't experience it myself. Now, though, there are people who talk again about things like military capability or toughness. I think Helmut Schmidt would have slapped them in the face for that. He would have said, "Have they all gone crazy? Do they even know what they're talking about? Our lives will be destroyed by this one day."
And Lieutenant Schmidt knew what war really means.
Of course he knew that, in every respect. He himself was at risk too, and he was never really, truly allowed to speak honestly. During the day, he had to appear in the uniforms of the Third Reich, bound by its discipline. And at night, he would say, "When will all this finally be over?"
Helmut Schmidt used to host Friday gatherings. You were among those invited. What was your impression of him?
That was the Friday Society. We met on the second Friday of every month. He was an incredibly sharp mind, and everyone was always waiting for what he would say. I always had the feeling that when you were with him, you were a bit like a student, not when you were alone with him, but in the group. He didn't really want to dominate, but he did through his remarkable personality, through his sharp intellect. And in a way, he guided the different minds in that Friday Society toward the direction he thought was right. But everyone I met there saw war as the greatest horror and the greatest danger. I hope no one ever forgets that.
Would a figure like Helmut Schmidt, a character like Helmut Schmidt, be needed in politics today?
Yes, I think we can say that without any hesitation. If we had him, and if he were younger, and if he were still physically fit, then Germany wouldn't have gone through such a terrible development as the one we're unfortunately witnessing now.
The Universität Kiel, das Präsidium der
The
Universität.
University of Kiel, its executive board, issued a circular stating, and I quote, "All employees and students of the University of Kiel are still prohibited from traveling to Russia." What do you think about that?
Ist weiter untersagt, nach Russland zu reisen. Was hältst du davon?
That's just madness. Because we all know, when we have problems with each other, there are really only two options. One is to cut off all contact and go into total confrontation, and the other is to talk to each other. Peace can only be achieved through communication. And if we trust one another, then I believe, and I think all Germans should think about this too, that by talking with each other, by exchanging ideas, we could actually gain a better future. We shouldn't forget that Germany has attacked Russia several times, once with Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. then again in the First World War. I just want to remind everyone that it was Germany that declared war, not Russia.
Ich möchte nur daran erinnern, dass Deutschland den Krieg erklärt hat und nicht Russland. Und beim zweiten Mal haben sie sich das auch noch gespart. Ich glaube, der Krieg ist gar nicht erklärt.
And for the second time, they even skipped that part. I don't think the war was ever actually declared. They just marched in. So we bear a significant share of the suffering in Russia. And when we think about the fact that today we can drive all the way to the Oder River in a united country, we owe that largely to Russia. I honestly can't understand how people can forget that. Because the happiest moment of my life, politically speaking, was when the borders opened, when we could suddenly drive to Schwerin, or Rostock, or Brandenburg. And suddenly, all those things we had only imagined before, we could actually experience ourselves. Those were truly emotional moments.
Und das waren wirklich so emotionale Erlebnisse. Ich habe immer gedacht, ich bin der Einzige, der irgendwie Tränen in den Augen hatte.
I always thought I was the only one who had tears in my eyes. But then I looked around at the others, and they did too. It was an incredible moment for everyone. And that feeling came back when Gorbachev came to Germany. People were different then, more open, more positive. Why should it be wrong to visit a country we have strong prejudices against? Prejudices always come from not knowing something, so why shouldn't we go there? Of course we should. We can't just learn from people who don't know the country either. I'm talking, for example, about journalists who just copy down whatever comes to mind, what they think is the truth, but they can't actually verify it.
Was eine Wahrheit ist, die sie aber nicht rektifizieren können.
Has a certain kind of provincialism and historical amnesia taken hold in Germany?
I think that's putting it rather mildly, but you're right. Yeah, I do think Germany has become quite a provincial country.
Hegel once wrote that the only thing you can really learn from history is that governments and nations never learn anything from it.
Ja, das ist eine sehr tragische.
Yes, that's a very tragic development, and you're absolutely right. And if we think about how many times we've tried, in one way or another, to go to war with Russia, well, that's just how it is. World War I, World War II. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call the Napoleonic Wars a German invention, but the Germans took part. Or at least some of them did. And we've come up with plenty of other things too. In our memory, in our history, we've done a lot of other things as well. I don't even want to start talking about the revolution. But there are answers to all of that. And the most important one is this. We never really knew Russia.
Wichtigste Antwort ist, wir haben Russland gar nicht gekannt. Und
And when our great chancellor describes Russia as, on the one hand, a great artistic nation, and he's right about that, one of the great countries, a country of deep culture, and on the other hand calls it a barbaric country, I have to ask, how does he even know that? Has he ever actually been here? Has he experienced the simple, everyday things here? Like, has he ever been to the theater? Has he seen how young the people are who go to the opera? Has he been to any other concert? Has he eaten in a restaurant here? No, of course he hasn't. Not at all. But he still has a fixed opinion. They all do. And all I can say is, go to this country yourself, and then you can judge for yourself.
Und dann könnt ihr selber beurteilen. Bleibt ihr bei diesem Ursprungsurteil?
Are you sticking with that original judgment or not? Or will something in you eventually say, wait a minute, things are completely different now. And why are we stuck in this kind of stew of narrow-mindedness and prejudice? We have to measure our judgments against reality and against the uniqueness that exists in this country too. Maybe then we'll come to some entirely new insights. And I thought that was wonderful. Because once again, what we're doing right now, only ever talking to one side, that's disastrous. One-sided reporting, one-sided prejudice can really only lead to catastrophe.
Kann eigentlich nur zur Katastrophe führen.
Is there still an effort to pull culture, art, and music into the current political conflicts as if they were a side in the fight.
in die aktuellen politischen Auseinandersetzungen. Wenn der
Also das kann ich hier überhaupt nicht sagen. Also ich mache hier,
Well,
ich
I
werde
really can't say that at all.
verschiedene Mozart
Next year, I'll be staging 6 different Mozart operas here. I'll be doing Fidelio, and I'll be presenting quite a few other German works as well.
und
I remember there was a time in Germany when things got so ideologically charged that it suddenly became a bit difficult to perform Tchaikovsky. I mean, come on. What does Tchaikovsky have to do with politics? Nothing at all. In fact, loving Tchaikovsky is in a way an act of peace. We should embrace Russian art. Russia is one of the great cultural nations, and I can only say I'm grateful to be able to experience all of this here. Just a few days ago, I saw War and Peace by Prokofiev, a heavenly work, a magnificent work. And of course, in literature, we already know what a masterpiece it is. But to experience the music as well, that's just incredible.
Die Musik dazu zu erleben, ist unglaublich.
Gergiev spielt nicht
Gergiev no longer performs in Munich. He can't perform there anymore. Other Russian artists can't appear in the West either. You were, at least for a while, barred from your own festival. Would you call that a form of Russophobia or even racism?
der Russophobie, des Rassismus gar.
Ja, irgendwo ist es irgendetwas, das wir gar nicht näher bezeichnen wollen.
Yes, in a way, it's something we don't even want to define more precisely. Because in our society, which already has such a bad reputation in so many areas, that kind of thing simply shouldn't exist. And when Mr. Merz says that Russia is also a barbaric country, how does he even come to say that? He doesn't actually know. But one thing it is, it's racism. We can't suddenly start doing what Hitler did. He spoke about Russians and Slavs in such a condescending and terrible way that we can only condemn it every single day. And I absolutely don't want to see us, in any way, start revealing to the world new theories born out of our own prejudices.
Aus unseren Vorurteilen herausgeboren, auch der Welt offenbaren.
Neigen
Are some people starting again to treat foreigners as if they were inferior?
Untermenschen zu behandeln?
Ja, also, als ich diesen merkwürdigen,
Well, when I heard that strange word, that barbarians thing, so barbaros actually comes from Greek, and originally it had something to do with beards, which is of course nonsense. But anyway, in the sense that's been passed down, we usually say barbarians are people with little culture. And that's exactly the opposite of what we're talking about here. Probably in a country like Russia, where there's so much theater, where so many young people are drawn to culture, where there's such enthusiasm for museums, for theater, for music, for opera, for everything really. You just can't say that. In fact, I sometimes think we should take a look at ourselves and ask what's actually barbaric in our own society. And there's quite a lot of that.
Was alles bei uns barbarisch ist, und da gibt es eine ganze Menge.
Du sprichst ja hier in
Here in Moscow, you talk to a lot of people, older people, younger people. You work with them, you spend time with them, you listen to them. How do they see Germany today?
auf das heutige Deutschland.
Also ich wundere mich eigentlich immer, aber
I'm always a bit surprised that people I know here still have such a positive view of the West. But that's starting to change a little. I'm worried that we're talking ourselves into fixed positions and that this could lead to a new kind of conflict, not just in the West, but in the East as well. Because, I mean, when our defense minister says that Germany has to be capable of waging war, and he says that quite explicitly with the East in mind, well, there are people here who pay very close attention to that. And some of them might end up approving new budgets for armaments because of it.
für Rüstung abnicken.
Ich habe mit der leitenden Historikerin
A few days ago, I spoke with the chief historian of the Battle of Stalingrad Museum in Volgograd.
diskutiert vor einigen
I asked her how she deals with the fact that today there are people in Germany again saying things like Johann Vadaful, Russia will always be our enemy and we have to be ready for war.
und
And she started to cry. How are the people you talk to feeling about this?
Wie geht's den Menschen, mit denen du sprichst?
Ja, das ist auch ähnlich, wobei wir sagen müssen,
Similar. Although we have to say, Mr. Waterful probably, well, I'm not even sure he can spell Mozart correctly, or whether he's ever read anything by Goethe. But one thing I do know, he's incredibly provincial. And I really don't understand what it means when people like that are allowed to lead the foreign ministry. We used to have great minds there once.
Is this decline of the political elites also a sign of decadence?
Wahrscheinlich. Ich meine, wenn wir die
Probably. I mean, if we wanted to describe the era of the West, maybe not quite as much today, but still, then it's also an age of hedonism. And hedonism, in Greece, in ancient Rome, and later maybe even during the Renaissance, didn't just contribute to the decline of those cultures. It actually caused it.
der jeweiligen Kultur nicht nur beigetragen, sondern sie geradezu verursacht.
Und wir haben hier heute wieder
And today we're seeing drone attacks again, even here in Moscow. More than 100 drones were shot down last night. What does that mean for you, as someone who has one foot in Germany and the other in Russia?
mit einem Bein in Deutschland stehst, mit einem Bein in Russland.
Ja, ich finde das ganz schrecklich. Und
Yes, I find that absolutely terrible. And I can only thank God that here in Germany, we're currently so safe that there aren't any drones suddenly being shot down over Hamburg or Berlin. But that could change, and we have to do everything we can to make sure it never comes to that. That's why, really, everyone is called upon to stand up for peace and to turn away from the tragedy of a new conflict. Not just to turn away from it, but to help make sure it never happens again.
beizutragen, dass das nie wieder so weit kommen wird.
Wie blickt der Musiker
How does the musician, the person, and also the political observer, Justus Frantz, view the attack on Iran?
Angriff auf den Iran?
Ach, dazu möchte ich meine, ich bin schon ein
I'm definitely a political person, but I really don't want to say anything about Iran. I spent 12 years as a conductor in Israel, and from that perspective, I've seen quite a lot. And I want to say that we Germans, of course, just as we have a special responsibility toward Russia, which somehow isn't being recognized, we also have that same kind of responsibility toward Israel. But I have to say, I reject any form of armed conflict. I find it simply terrible. War is no longer a means we can justify in our time, not with the weapons we have today. That's just not possible anymore.
Das können wir heute nicht mehr argumentieren. Das geht nicht mehr.
Wenn man sich die Äußerungen der
When you listen to what politicians say today, for example, Donald Trump, who says things like, "I'll bomb them back to the Stone Age," or "I'll wipe out a civilization," would you call that a moral collapse, a moral decline?
Zerfall, ein moralischer Niedergang?
Also, ich finde das
I find what Tom said truly unspeakable. And I believe our task is to help all people in such a way that they can live in a cultivated and spiritually inspired way. So that, coming back to my point, the unspeakable, which is war, never happens. Unfortunately, we live in a time when it keeps happening.
Leider leben wir in einer Zeit, wo es dauernd stattfindet.
In einer Zeit der Kriege.
In a time of war, does this also mean that the West is turning away from the ideals of the Enlightenment and from the ideas of classicism and classical concert music?
Der Klassik und der klassischen Kunstmusik.
Natürlich. Letzten Endes ist es
Of course, of course. In the end, it's a sign, whether it's Bach and his love for God. He always ended his works with the words, "The highest honor belongs to the dear Lord." That shows, on one hand, humility, and on the other, an awareness of the real truth. And it's also about the connection that art gives us all, as a bridge to one another. Music is never a weapon. Music is always a bridge. And when we make music, we do it out of love for people. That's a great source of inspiration, and something truly wonderful.
Das ist eine große Inspiration und etwas Herrliches.
Was kann
What can music do in times of war?
Kriege leisten?
Also, ich habe mit Valery Gergiev die
So, I founded the German-Soviet Youth Philharmonic together with Valery Gergiev. These were young people who got to know each other and suddenly created harmony together. We all reached out our hands and believed in the shared future of our common European home. Unfortunately, we didn't do it often enough. But there's still a chance to create peace when we make music together. We don't shoot. We create harmony, something truly unique.
Wir stellen Harmonie her, etwas Einzigartiges.
Where does the project stand today?
Das Projekt ist die Philharmonie der Nation.
The project is the Philharmony of Nations. And of course, I'm looking for ways to make it happen. Projects like this always need funding, and without money, I really can't do something like that. But it would be the greatest dream of my life to perform once more with this fantastic orchestra.
Noch einmal in meinem Leben wieder mit diesem fantastischen Orchester aufzutreten.
For example, just like your fellow conductor Daniel Barenboim does with the West Eastern Divan.
Gemacht hat, muss man fast sagen. Ich weiß nicht, ob es noch macht, aber
You could almost say he did. I'm not sure if he still does. But yes, he studied very closely how our Philharmonic of Nations was organized. And we ourselves also tried to make music with musicians from Israel and the surrounding countries. We played a few times with musicians from those regions, but for us, the musical standard was probably much higher than the political one. On the one hand, it was very important to us to bring together people who were actually enemies. But of course, they also had to be able to play at the very highest level. Sometimes our rehearsals lasted almost 10 hours. Where do you still find that today? You can only do that if, on the one hand, you have a certain tolerance for hardship, but on the other, and that's much more important, an incredible enthusiasm that goes far beyond your own life.
Enthusiasmus, der weit über das eigene Leben hinausgeht.
Can music succeed in reclaiming public space, which, in Germany, we've largely lost to the warmongers, for the idea of peace?
Das wäre eine Möglichkeit, aber ich glaube,
That would be one option. But I think right now the Germans need a bit more time to really understand. And I hope we'll be given that time, that war won't be seen as an option. And all the things that keep being said and discussed, coming back to what we said at the beginning, we've seen that the Germans and the Europeans were the aggressors. But I can't recall the Russians, really. Of course, they defended themselves. They had to, but they weren't the ones who started out as the warmongers.
aber sie waren nicht von sich aus erstmal die Kriegstreiber. Und insofern, also glaube ich, dass
So I believe that through music and through understanding one another, we could actually achieve quite a lot. And I hope there are people out there who are farsighted, who are cultivated, and who see it as a matter of the spirit that we keep pushing forward with our art. And that we keep remembering, art is always a bridge, never a weapon. We're not Goebbels. We want to reach people through the heart, through the mind, and with a message of peace.
mit dem Geist und mit einer Friedensbotschaft erreichen.
Are people in Germany right now just dozing off as they head toward collapse?
Also in irgendeiner Form, wenn ich nach Deutschland fahre.
When I travel to Germany these days, I get the feeling as if someone sprayed Valium all over the country. People there accept everything with a kind of patience I never thought possible. Take the trains, for example, say from Hamburg to Berlin. They just cancel a whole morning service, and everyone seems to take it in stride. We used to make fun of Italy for that, thinking it was somehow charming how cheerfully Italians put up with all the inconveniences of a society that no longer really functions.
Zivilisatorisch nicht mehr funktionierende Gesellschaft hinnehmen. Heute aber, muss ich sagen, erlebe ich das bei den
But today I have to say, I see the same thing happening in Germany. Maybe with a little less humor, but still with an incredible amount of patience. That it doesn't seem to matter that trains are constantly late, that it doesn't matter that Lufthansa is always on strike, that it doesn't matter when this or that stops working, or that everything's getting a bit dirty. That I just can't understand. I love this Germany, and I want it to be the way it once was again, a peaceful, pacifist country with a real sense of responsibility for the future.
Mit einem gewissen Anspruch an die Zukunft.
How do you explain the election results in Baden-Württemberg, where in the state elections 2/3 of all votes went to parties that push for war, the Greens and the CDU?
Bei den Grünen habe ich nun.
I've had some really strange experiences with the Greens. I used to be very close friends with Petra Kelly and Gerd Bastian, And Petra Kelly was once the chair of the Green Party. Back then it was a pacifist party, but today it's a party that in one way or another supports weapons, rearmament, and I don't even know what else. I just don't understand how the members of the Greens can suddenly follow a party leadership that's doing the exact opposite of what the Greens were originally founded for. And so, when it comes to things like that, well, I don't really follow the state election results closely. I know Cem Özdemir, and I don't think he's a warmonger, but honestly, I don't know. I really have no idea.
Ich habe keine Ahnung, also ehrlich gestanden, das muss ich auch sagen. Ich will mich nicht auch Dinge über...
To be honest, I have to say this too. I don't want to comment on things I don't know enough about. But of course, Baden-Württemberg is very important, and Germany's auto industry is largely based there. If that industry collapses, Germany will eventually become a very poor country. That makes it all the more important that we have culture, that we have art, that we're not barbarians, as some people like to say. We need to keep passing on to the next generations what has always defined Germany, being a great cultural nation, and bring that forward again. Better education and better opportunities for people to take part in one way or another.
Bessere Chancen, sich in irgendeiner Form zu beteiligen.
Sagt der große Dirigent Justus Frantz.
The great conductor Justus Frantz once said that Germany feels like a country where someone has poured Valium over the population. And he calls on all of us to remember that music is a force that connects nations. Here on Against the Current, we show you viewpoints and perspectives the propaganda media keep hidden. Thank you very much and stay tuned.
Verschweigen. Herzlichen Dank und
Gerne.
bleiben Sie dran.